You ever notice how the moment someone stops chasing, the one who was running suddenly stops to look back? It's like emotional gravity flips. That's not just psychology, it's human behavior at its most raw. Today, we're diving into what happens when the anxious finally detaches, and why it's often the exact moment the avoidant starts to feel the loss. When someone with an anxious attachment style decides to detach, it disrupts one of the most deeply ingrained patterns in an avoidant anxious dynamic. Typically, the anxious partner is the one who keeps reaching out, initiating conversations, trying to fix things, asking questions, seeking reassurance, and bending themselves backward just to feel close to the other person. Their entire emotional system is wired around closeness and connection. So when that closeness feels threatened, they panic, they overcompensate, they chase. It's not because they're needy or weak, it's because they care deeply. And in many cases, they've learned to equate love with effort, with proving their value through emotional labor. In contrast, avoidant individuals often respond to this behavior with withdrawal. They pull back, they need space, they become cold or distant, not necessarily because they don't care, but because closeness triggers discomfort in them. It makes them feel suffocated or vulnerable in ways they don't know how to handle. So the more the anxious person tries to close the gap, the more the avoidant pulls away, creating a painful loop where the anxious becomes more desperate and the avoidant becomes more distant. It's exhausting for both people, but especially for the one doing all the chasing. Now, when the anxious partner finally reaches the point of detachment, it's not sudden. It's usually the result of countless emotional letdowns. They've waited for the call that never came, sat through the silence, watched the other person walk away from conflict instead of toward resolution, and tolerated breadcrumb affection that never leads to anything stable. And eventually, something shifts. The anxious person stops asking. They stop texting. They stop offering parts of themselves that were never being received with care. It's not that they've stopped caring entirely, it's that they've started protecting their own peace. This detachment isn't loud. It doesn't come with fireworks or big declarations. It's quiet, it's calm, but its impact is seismic. The rhythm that kept the relationship dynamic going, chase, retreat, falls apart. The avoidant no longer has something to run from because the anxious partner is no longer running toward them. That constant emotional pressure that the avoidant once found overwhelming is gone, and in its place is space. But it's not the space they used to crave. It's the kind of space that starts to feel eerily empty. That's the moment where something begins to shift in the avoidant partner. They were used to having control over the emotional tempo. They could create distance, knowing the anxious partner would reach across it. But now that the anxious one has pulled back, not with resentment, but with resolve, the avoidant begins to feel the discomfort of emotional disconnection, not as relief, but as loss. That person who used to be so available, so emotionally present, so willing to engage and repair and hold space, is now quiet. They're no longer available for emotional caretaking. They're no longer on standby for inconsistency. What often surprises the avoidant is that for the first time, they're left with their own feelings, without the buffer of someone else's emotional pursuit to distract them. The anxious person was the mirror they could avoid looking into. And now, with that mirror gone, they're left staring at the emptiness they once mistook for peace. Their sense of control starts to erode, not because the other person is punishing them, but because the anxious partner's detachment reveals what the avoidant never had to confront before, the consequences of emotional distance. This shift in dynamic is powerful because it breaks the unspoken agreement that held the relationship in imbalance. The anxious person used to take responsibility for the emotional connection, carrying the weight of both people's feelings just to keep the bond intact. But when they step out of that role, the avoidant can no longer lean on that imbalance. They're now left with the silence they once sought, and for many, that silence becomes unbearable. Avoidant individuals often seek space and distance, not because they don't feel anything, but because what they feel is too overwhelming or too unfamiliar to process. When someone is avoidant, their internal world is governed by a strong desire for independence, control, and emotional self-sufficiency. Deep emotional closeness can feel threatening, not in a logical, conscious way, but in a way that's rooted in old patterns of avoidance and protection. So when someone gets too close, especially someone with anxious tendencies who wants to connect on a deep emotional level, the avoidant reacts by pulling away. They withdraw, they detach, they minimize the importance of the relationship, and often convince themselves they're better off alone. They tell themselves the other person is too intense, too emotional, too demanding, or just not right for them. But here's what's fascinating. While the avoidant partner is pulling away, they're often still emotionally tethered. They don't always detach in the way it appears on the surface. Even though they create distance, they often continue to think about the person they've stepped away from. They may not reach out or express it, but the emotional connection doesn't just vanish. What really keeps them comfortable is knowing that the other person, the anxious one, is still there, still available, still emotionally invested, still hoping. There's a kind of psychological safety in knowing someone is waiting in the wings, that their affection is guaranteed, that their place in the avoidance life is secure even if neglected. The anxious partner, in this case, becomes a source of both comfort and emotional overwhelm for the avoidant. Their consistent attempts to connect are simultaneously appreciated and resented. It's a contradiction that sits at the heart of many avoidant anxious relationships. The avoidant often wants love, but only on their terms, when it doesn't feel too close, when it doesn't require too much vulnerability, when it doesn't threaten the independence they've spent so long protecting. They often crave connection, but once it gets too real, too raw, or too intimate, they retreat. It's not always a conscious choice. For many avoidants, this cycle is automatic. A deeply ingrained emotional reflex developed through early experiences where closeness was inconsistent, unreliable, or unsafe. But the moment that emotional safety net disappears, the moment the anxious partner detaches and stops reaching out, the dynamic flips. What was once taken for granted becomes painfully noticeable in its absence. That reliable presence, those constant check-ins, the emotional effort the anxious person poured into the relationship, all of it suddenly goes quiet. And now the avoidant finds themselves in unfamiliar emotional territory. The distance they created no longer brings relief, it brings uncertainty. The connection they kept at arm's length is now out of reach, and for the first time they can't rely on it being there whenever they feel ready to return. This is where craving begins. It's not always immediate. At first, the avoidant might feel relief, a sense of freedom, or even superiority. They might believe they made the right choice by stepping back. But over time, a quiet awareness starts to build. That person who once filled a space in their life with presence and emotional depth is gone. Not physically maybe, but energetically. There's no more reassurance, no more emotional labor being done on their behalf. No more "I miss you" texts or vulnerable invitations to reconnect. And for an avoidant, that kind of emotional silence can become loud, deafening even, because they were never taught how to sit in emotional discomfort. They were never taught how to pursue or initiate connection in a vulnerable, exposed way. So when the anxious partner detaches, it forces the avoidant to feel what they've spent years avoiding: need, uncertainty, emotional risk. What they begin to crave isn't just the person. It's the sense of emotional grounding that person provided, the way they felt seen, wanted, and significant, even if they never admitted it, the way they could rely on someone else's emotional investment without having to reciprocate at the same level. Once that dynamic disappears, it leaves behind a void, not just in their routine, but in their identity, because whether they knew it or not, that connection became a part of their emotional structure. And when the anxious partner stops offering their energy, attention, and affection, the avoidant is left to face the reality that maybe they didn't want distance after all. Maybe they just didn't know how to be close. Emotional unavailability is often misunderstood. It's easy to label someone as cold, distant, or indifferent when they avoid vulnerability, but the truth is rarely that simple. Emotional unavailability is usually a defense mechanism, not a personality trait. It's built over time, layer by layer, often in response to early emotional experiences that taught someone it's safer to guard their feelings than to express them. People who develop avoidant tendencies didn't wake up one day and decide to be distant. They likely learned, sometimes from childhood, that emotional closeness comes with risk. Risk of being rejected, misunderstood, smothered, or not having their needs met. As a result, they grow up with a deep belief that self-protection is safer than emotional intimacy. So when someone emotionally unavailable enters into a relationship, they often keep one foot out the door. They might be present physically, but they're careful about how much they reveal, how close they let someone get, how often they share their inner world. They don't do this out of cruelty or manipulation. They do it to stay safe. Intimacy feels like a threat to their independence and emotional equilibrium. The more someone tries to connect, the more the emotionally unavailable person feels pressure. That pressure, even if it's coming from a healthy and loving place, activates an old fear that if they allow themselves to be seen, they'll lose control. This is why emotional unavailability thrives in a certain kind of dynamic, especially with someone who is anxiously attached. The anxious partner often interprets the emotional walls of the avoidant as a challenge to overcome, something to fix or understand. So they lean in, they ask more questions, they initiate more conversations, they try harder to connect. Their intention is to get closer, but to the emotionally unavailable partner, that attempt at closeness often feels overwhelming. They start to pull away, not always with malice, but out of an instinct to self-protect. They may withdraw into work, become vague with their words, or shut down emotionally when conflict arises. This becomes a push and pull dynamic where one person is reaching for closeness and the other is reaching for space. But here's where it gets interesting. When the anxious partner finally stops reaching, when they detach emotionally, not as a strategy, but as an act of self-respect, it begins to unravel that carefully constructed emotional distance. The person who has spent so long staying unavailable now has to face something they've never truly prepared for, the absence of pursuit. For so long, they operated in a relationship where someone else carried the emotional weight. They could rely on the other person to initiate, to repair, to hold space. They didn't have to do the vulnerable work of connection because the anxious partner did it for both of them. But when that stops, when the anxious partner steps back and stops feeding the dynamic, emotional unavailability becomes a lonely place to sit. In the stillness, the avoidant or emotionally unavailable person is left with their own thoughts and feelings without the distraction of someone else's emotional labor. They start to notice the quiet, not as peace, but as absence. What once felt like safety now feels like distance they didn't actually want. And because emotional unavailability was always a shield, not a true preference, they begin to feel the discomfort of their own walls. They may not know how to express it, but they begin to feel the ache of something missing. And it's not just the person, they miss the connection that person brought into their life. The space that used to feel comfortably empty now feels hollow. This shift challenges everything they've told themselves about love and closeness. For the first time, they might start questioning their patterns. They might reflect on how often they've pushed people away. They might realize that the distance they created protected them from vulnerability, but also robbed them of intimacy. They start to crave what they once ran from, not because the other person changed, but because the other person stopped playing their role in the old dynamic. And without that role being filled, the emotionally unavailable person is forced to confront the consequences of their emotional choices. That confrontation, quiet, unsettling, sometimes confusing, is often the first real opportunity for growth. Not because they suddenly become available, but because they finally begin to feel what emotional distance truly costs. True power in relationships doesn't come from controlling the other person's actions, convincing them to love you, or trying to manage their emotional availability. It comes from recognizing your own value and choosing to stop abandoning yourself in the name of connection. When someone consistently fails to meet your needs, when they minimize your feelings, when they keep you at a distance and show you through their actions that they're not emotionally available, there comes a moment where you have to decide what matters more, being chosen by them or choosing yourself. That's the moment everything begins to shift, not in them, but in you. People with anxious attachment styles often struggle with this. They feel a deep need to connect, to be validated, to feel safe in someone else's presence. And when that safety is threatened, when the connection feels unstable or inconsistent, they try harder. They reach out more, give more, accommodate more. They think, maybe if I love them better, they'll see me. Maybe if I'm more understanding, more patient, more forgiving, they'll show up differently. And that effort comes from a beautiful place. It's rooted in love, hope, and a desire for closeness. But what often gets lost in that process is self-worth. The anxious partner can get so focused on keeping the connection alive that they start to betray themselves. They ignore their boundaries. They make excuses for behavior that hurts. They silence their needs because they don't want to scare the other person away. But no one should have to work that hard to be loved. When love feels like a constant negotiation of your own needs, it stops being love and starts being survival. And that's not a place where a healthy relationship can grow. Real connection doesn't require you to shrink yourself, to prove your worth through overgiving, or to live in a constant state of emotional tension. It requires mutual presence, mutual effort, and emotional safety on both sides. When that's missing, staying in the relationship becomes more about fear than love. Fear of being alone, fear of not finding better, fear of letting go of the potential you once believed in. The turning point happens when the anxious partner realizes that no amount of chasing will create safety with someone who doesn't know how to hold it. That's when the power begins to return. Not because the other person changes, but because you stop trying to earn love and start reclaiming your right to receive it freely. You stop hoping that if you do one more thing, they'll finally open up. You stop waiting for their crumbs to feel like a meal. And instead, you begin to ask yourself, what do I actually deserve? This doesn't always look dramatic from the outside. It can be subtle. You stop initiating contact. You stop making excuses for their behavior. You start honoring your feelings instead of second-guessing them. You sit with your discomfort instead of trying to fix theirs. You start living your life for you, not for their approval or attention. That's not coldness. That's clarity. And with clarity comes peace. The most powerful moment in any relationship is when you choose to stop convincing someone of your worth. That's not bitterness, it's maturity. It's the moment you realize that love without consistency, presence, and respect is not love you have to keep fighting for. And when you stop fighting for it, you stop draining yourself. You get to redirect all that energy you once spent trying to hold someone else's heart, back into yourself, your healing, your joy, your wholeness. It's in that space of detachment that you begin to see things clearly. You notice the ways you were overextending, the ways you were staying hopeful while ignoring the reality in front of you. And slowly, you begin to forgive yourself, not for loving, but for staying too long in places that didn't love you back in the way you needed. You start to understand that choosing yourself isn't selfish. It's necessary. Because every time you choose yourself, you strengthen the belief that you are worthy of the kind of love that doesn't require you to earn it. Detachment, when it comes from a place of self-awareness, is not about revenge, punishment, or playing games. It's about healing. It's about recognizing the emotional patterns that have kept you locked in cycles of over-functioning, chasing love, and constantly doubting your worth. When someone finally detaches from a dynamic that has repeatedly made them feel anxious, unseen, or emotionally depleted, it's rarely because they've stopped caring. It's because they've started caring differently. Not less, but smarter. With boundaries, with intention, with clarity about what they can no longer accept in exchange for closeness. In relationships where one person has been anxiously attached and the other avoidant, detachment can feel like a seismic shift. The anxious person is often the one who holds the emotional tension of the relationship. They notice the silence first. They feel the disconnection early. They become hyper-aware of the emotional temperature between them and their partner, and out of fear of abandonment or disapproval, they work overtime to bridge the gap. They reach out, they ask questions, they make plans, they apologize even when they're not at fault, all to maintain a fragile connection that often feels one-sided. That effort can become exhausting, not just physically, but emotionally and spiritually, because it sends a message to the nervous system that your value is tied to your ability to keep the relationship alive. That love is something you earn through effort, patience, and sacrifice. That if you stop showing up, the connection dies. So for the anxious partner, detachment doesn't come easy. It usually comes after countless moments of disappointment, after they've tried everything, after they've held space, waited, rationalized, and hoped only to feel the same emotional emptiness over and over again. But when they finally detach, something powerful happens. The emotional burden begins to lift. There's no more chasing, no more over-explaining, no more trying to decode mixed signals. Instead, there's space, stillness, silence, yes, but not the kind that stings like rejection. This silence feels different. It feels like a boundary. It feels like self-protection. And it's in that space that healing begins. Detachment isn't the same as indifference. You can still love someone and decide that being close to them isn't good for you. You can miss someone and still recognize that your peace matters more. You can hold compassion for them and still hold boundaries for yourself. The beauty of detachment is that it allows you to keep your heart open, but no longer at the cost of your self-respect. You stop sacrificing your needs to keep the relationship afloat. You stop waiting for potential. You stop romanticizing inconsistency. What detachment also reveals is your own resilience. You begin to realize how much strength it takes to choose yourself, to walk away from something that once held so much of your emotional energy, to not react when they finally reach out again, when they notice your absence, when they begin to crave the connection they once ran from. Because it's not that you're trying to make them feel your absence. It's that you're finally starting to feel your own presence again. You're reconnecting with parts of yourself that got lost in the pursuit of someone else. There's often a quiet grief that comes with detachment, not just for the person, but for the version of you that stayed too long, tried too hard, and loved too deeply without reciprocity. But there's also pride. There's peace in knowing that you didn't close your heart. You simply chose to stop bleeding for someone who couldn't hold it with care. And that distinction is everything, because healing isn't about building walls. It's about building discernment. It's about knowing the difference between someone who is unavailable and someone who is unwilling. And more importantly, it's about recognizing when it's no longer your job to wait for someone to change. When detachment comes from this place, it transforms you. You stop defining your worth by how much someone wants you. You stop measuring love by how hard you have to fight for it. And you start creating space for something healthier, something mutual, stable, and grounded in emotional presence. Not because you need it to feel whole, but because you already are.